Thanks for the download. If you like what we're doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a hopefully 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever platform you're listening on. If you want to support the pod, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep the production cost to the minimum. I first recorded this as a 2-part interview with Parachute Regiment soldier Jimmy Moram 4 years ago as part of a discussion on his career as a soldier. This podcast has had the audio improved and focuses on the discussion we had about the battle for Mount Longdon during the Falklands War in '82, and it's been released as one episode. It's a compelling first-hand account focusing on initial deployment preparations, the sea journey south, training at Ascension Island, landing at St Carlos Water, and the subsequent ground campaign culminating in the battle for Mount Longdon in the final surrender. Jimmy describes the harsh conditions, challenges with equipment, the mindset of the soldiers facing a well-defended enemy, and the small unit tactics during the intense night assault. The account also highlights the dedication and bravery of the soldiers, including those in support roles like cooks and clerks, who carried ammo and evacuated casualties under fire. It emphasised that victory came down to determination, the ability of junior soldiers to continue fighting when leadership structures broke down, and the excellent training level of the troops. The Battle for Longdon demonstrated the high cost of attacking a well-defended and entrenched enemy position with limited mobility, inferior equipment, working in the dark. Let's crack on.
We were stationed in Tidworth, just outside Salisbury Plain training area. At that time, we were conducting a support weapons cadre. So we had new guys basically from the rifle companies who wanted to transfer into the anti-tanks mortars or the machine guns. And we were about halfway through those cadres when the word of the invasion came through. We continued to train the guys on the cadres. The rest of the battalion basically just got themselves geared up, ready to deploy down to the docks and sail. More about that in a minute. We were the spearhead battalion for the army at that time, and we were also the lead parachute battalion group. As today, there's always one para battalion on notice to move all the time. 2 para were our reserve battalion for a parachute follow-up, and they were on 5 days notice to move. So basically, both 3 and 2 para were ready to rock right from the word go.
And do you think, we've all seen in the army where people have been at notice to move, and sometimes it's a bit of a bluff, but do you feel, Jimmy, that at that time that the training you guys had carried out and being on that 5 days notice to move, you were genuinely ready to go at that time?
100%. But being an airborne formation, this is our bread and butter. It is being operationally ready to deploy at very, very short notice. And we've done that over the years and still continue to do so. We're equipped and trained to do that. Unfortunately, unlike 5 Brigade, who weren't, and it was to their cost later on when they were actually arrived on the island. We were up for it. We were ready. And as soon as we given notification that this was going to happen, we geared up ready to go to the docks and deploy with the amphibious force.
And were you able to carry out any sort of pre-deployment training, or was there just not enough time?
No, there wasn't any time. We'd been very lucky. In the year before, we'd carried out as a battalion some really, really intense live-firing exercises up to company level with support arms. So we were very, very well exercised. Just no time to do any further training. And to be honest, I don't think it was required. All we then needed at a later date was refresher training. And again, when I come on to the sailing phase down south, I'll cover a little bit of the training.
So no mobile phones back then, mate. How did they get everybody back to camp?
Apparently, one of the companies was on leave. I've got no recollection of that whatsoever, and we certainly weren't. But I know they phoned up all the major railway stations in London, and they put up a notice basically saying, if you're free para, get yourself back to Tidworth now. And guys who were deploying on leave got word, and to a man, they all came back quite quickly.
All worried they're going to be left out, no doubt.
Pre-mobile days. So you just started talking about the journey south. So give us an idea about the journey south. What sort of training you did going down, and what type of briefings did you receive?
Right, okay. Quick order of events. The Invasion was on the 2nd of April. The carrier group departed on the 5th. Absolutely outstanding getting that together and deploying in that kind of timeline. We sailed on the Canberra on the 9th of April. Again, damn good effort by the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine in getting that vessel turned from being basically a cruise liner into what became an assault ship. So we sailed on the 9th. There was us and 2 commando units, if I remember rightly, on board the vessel. So it's quite packed and supporting arms as well. We're building 2 helicopter decks, one forward and one rear. And that construction stayed in place until at least Ascension. So basically, this ship was getting worked on for the whole time we were going down south, at least as far as Ascension. For ourselves, scant information at that stage on Argentinian forces, whether it be Army, Navy, Air Force. And I think somebody just grabbed a copy of the Jane's volume for that year and perused the pages, which had Argentina's forces in it. So very, very little information at all, until we got some back briefs from the Marine unit that had been in place on the island when it was attacked. Those lads were on board the Canberra with us, and certainly some of their senior NCOs and officers were. And we started to get information trickling down from those guys as to what that invasion force at that time consisted of. It was all quite daunting, as you can imagine. We were just basically a light infantry unit, ourselves and the commandos, heading down to basically retake the Falkland Islands, free the people, and we're going to be fighting a country which had a very viable navy, an excellent air force, and a half-decent army.
Did you feel, was there sort of, before you sort of got to the Falklands, Jim, and you're heading down there, was there a feeling that the politicians would sort it all out, or were you just focused from the start, right, we're going down there for a fight? We
were under no illusion that we would end up on the islands either way, that we were either going to fight for them, or if there was a political solution, we'd still sail there and garrison the islands during that sort of interim while things were calming down. So for all intents and purposes, as far as we were concerned, we were going down to the Falklands, either to fight or to garrison. And we were preparing to go to war. It was simple as that. We weren't really interested in what the politicians were doing. We were getting daily updates, but it was war fighting focus. That's where we were.
Oh, I wonder if, because we had the leadership was still from the Second World War, their mindset was different to, let's say, the mindset of the 21st century senior management or leadership in the armed forces. In the Second World War, they were very much akin to, right, we're going to make something happen. Let's just do it as we go along. And they made it work. And I'm wondering if that was still the mindset at the top when they were putting together a task force and getting them out the door as quickly as possible. Because
I would fully, I would fully agree with that. Oh, all 3 heads of staff, all World War II veterans, as you say, an ex-Lancaster bomber pilot, a submarine and destroyer captain, and a guy that had landed on D-Day.
Yeah,
you know what better guys to have at the helm of what was then Britain's biggest war since Korea.
Yeah. And they had that can-do, we're going to make it work. Once they had the politicians behind them, right, we'll just get some ships, we'll bolt it together, we'll get everyone sailing, and we'll fix it as we go down. It feels like today we'd be a bit slower. We'd have to put other things in place and other equipment. It would take a lot longer to roll out the door, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, the plan was by no means perfect, and the odds were massively stacked against us. I saw a quote from the United States Navy after the war that their assessment of a successful reinvasion by the British forces was a military impossibility. Okay, so for this task force to get put together and deployed in that space of time, and then retake the islands in that space of time, it was an unbelievable undertaking by all involved, not just Power Edge, everybody that had any influence on the operation whatsoever. It was very, very impressive.
Yeah. So what other training then were you doing on board, Jimmy?
We very, very quickly sorted ourselves out on board. Space was limited, so it was a case of the commandos booking various rooms, us taking our turn. We had a promenade deck around the vessel, which was exactly a quarter of a mile long, so you can guess what that was used for. And we did everything from basic PT up to 10 milers. That got a bit daft, to be honest. The Marines one day would run around in PT kit, us being paras. The next day we would run around in boots and denims. The Marines next day would run around in assault order. Next day we'd run around with a Bergen on. They turn up the next day with 2 Bergens and an anchor tucked under their arm. Yeah, we're just going
Rivalry then, Jimmy.
absolutely. But it was great fun. I mean, for all the rivalry, there was absolutely no issues, between any of the units on board. And it was a simple case of everybody just trying to outdo everybody else. So, with regards to training, we basically carried out every refresher training on every subject you could ever carry while on a vessel going to sea. So basic infantry skills, map reading, battle first aid and the like. We fired all our platoon weapons over the side of the vessel. We had some very good presentations from the naval gunfire guys. One of the stars of the presentation actually was a young naval radio operator by the name of Larry, who I was to bump into some years later on when handed over the role of chief instructor at 473 Battery. So yes, we trained and we trained and we trained.
When you got to Ascension, I think Ascension Island was hugely important to the task force, because I understand from my reading that a lot of ships were loaded as quick as they could, but when they got to Ascension, that was a chance to shake out, sort of reorder the loading on the ships, but also, more importantly for you guys, get a chance to do some landing craft drills and some other training. So what did Ascension enable you to do, and how important do you think that was?
On the actual operation, it was invaluable. That was, in essence, our logistics echelon. Without that base in the Middle Atlantic, we'd have really struggled to have done what we did. Everything that we didn't have anyway was flown in there to then be put on vessels later on. Further units were flown into Ascension to then join us at that stage of the game. And we trained on the island itself. It's a small volcanic rock sitting in the middle of the Atlantic, very, very hot tropical conditions. It allowed us to go onshore and basically fire every weapon system within the battle group. So that was everything from the SLR up to our mortars and 120mm guns and our Milan anti-tank. I don't believe any of the artillery units went ashore, and certainly our rifle companies carried out some good tactical 10-milers as well while they were on there. With regards to assault craft landing training, we did it incessantly, day after day. We were there for about 5 or 6 days in total offshore. So it was loading drills. We then come onto the beach landings. There was only one beach on Ascension that you could carry out the landings on, and the waters were absolutely full of sharks. I've never seen so many sharks in my life. Nobody swims that lives on Ascension Island. They stay on the land. And you can imagine at night time, the guys were sneaking half their supper up their jumpers up onto the deck and then hoying, bits of meat and all sorts over the side of the ship to watch the sharks devour it. However, that was double-edged, because come the time that we were actually going to carry out the landing drills, we told the Royal Marine coxswains on no uncertain terms that there was no way they were going to lower that ramp until we were at least halfway up that beach. And that's exactly how it went. So, yeah, drills and drills and drills again, so we could do it basically in our sleep.
And again, I think another big contrast, I mean, we've got the World War II sort of piece coming through this again, but it's probably pretty fair to say that battlefield first aid back then probably wasn't that much different towards how it was in World War II. Is that a fair assessment, sort of the training you got?
Yes, very, very simple. Breathing, bleeding, breaks and burns, and that was it. Nothing more than shell dressing. We didn't use drips, and we weren't trained how to use them. It was the basics. Control of hemorrhage, gunshot wounds, burns, fractured limbs. As simple as that. Well, one point on that, when we were actually in what was going to become the ship's sick bay, being taught our battlefield first aid, we were all sat in big plastic sacks about the size of a 50-gallon oil drum. And I'm sat in one of these, and I looked in between my legs at the label on top of the bag, and it said, "Bags, body, human remains." So that was a great morale raiser for that. We're all sat in body bags.
I think it's I think first aid in the Falklands is a very interesting subject on a number of levels. Firstly, the sort of the regimental aid post level. And again, Jimmy, you can correct me on this, but I understand a lot of regimental aid posts in the Falklands and was a bit of a hollow in the ground somewhere where the stretcher bearers took the casualties to the regimental medical officer and the orderlies. So there was nothing fancy. It was, a lot of cases, just a dip in the ground. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. As I'll explain later on, there was very little cover in the Falklands. When we're actually on Longdon, in amongst the rocks, the RAP came to the bottom of the feature, just as you described there, tucked itself in the little hollow alongside a large slab of rock and operated from there, and providing absolutely invaluable life-saving service to the battalion. Very brave people.
Yeah, amazing. I think the fitness of the soldiers, the dedication of the sort of the medical staff, and I've read a few accounts as well where the cold weather helped quite a bit, slow bleeding and slow the body system down, so that guys, who maybe have died in a warmer climate were able to survive.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. In those days, it was a case of always banging in the drip as your sort of first action in an RAP. But because a lot of our guys, my gunner included, were laid out basically shot and bleeding throughout the whole of the night, the low temperatures basically just slowed down the bleeding and then just simply cauterized the wound and they stopped bleeding. Had they had fluids pumped in them, it's pretty likely that might have kept the bleeding going.
All right.
So yeah, it caused a bit of a rethink after the campaign.
Yeah.
Regarding treating gunshot wounds, giving fluids, etc. when you're in those cold conditions. And certainly a lot of our lads were laid out there for a long, long time, many hours with multiple gunshot wounds and survived. And they put it down to the slow bleeding due to the low temperatures.
Yeah, amazing. And then to survive that, well, one of the other things we'll just briefly cover is what was called the Red and Green Life Machine, which was the field hospital, which was set up by a surgeon captain, Rick Jolly. He was responsible for 3 sort of field hospitals out there, but the Red and Green Life Machine was probably the best known. He was the only serviceman in the Falklands War to be honoured by both the British and Argentinian sides, and the awards were for his recognition and achievements in managing 3 frontline field hospitals in which more than 1,000 casualties, among them 300 Argentinian soldiers and airmen, were treated. Interesting about that Red and Green Life Machine was every person that went in there wounded survived. Again, absolutely unbelievable. Jolly was a senior medical officer, 3 Commando Brigade, and he had intended to use the SS Canberra as a floating field hospital, but the ship's vulnerability to air attack meant that it needed to be kept 200 miles at sea. So he's given 90 minutes notice to set up his first field hospital, the Red and Green Life Machine, which is a single-storey derelict meat processing plant at Ajax Bay, one of the 3 British landing sites on the western coast of East Falkland. Sadly, Rick Jolly died a few years ago, only at the very comparatively young age of 71. So, Jimmy, covered a bit about the sort of the prep going down, but for any soldier, the ground and the weather are always dead important. So, what was the ground and weather like?
Well, South Atlantic, heading into what was going to become their winter. Very, very cold. Temperatures hovering on or around 0. Constant wind, which really was the main issue. Rain, sleet, and snow at quite regular intervals. The biggest issue, really, I'd say, was the fact that you were wet most of the time. I've been colder on Sennybridge training area. However, the temperatures combined with the wind and the wet, we were very simply, from the day we landed till the day we left, we were damp. At best, soaking wet most of the time. And that was the weather we had. There were some lovely days, crystal clear, but still with that constant wind. Most of the time, it was absolutely freezing.
And you talked about Sennybridge there, Jimmy, and would you say, I mean, I've seen the pictures, but I wouldn't want to make a presumption, but it does seem very similar to Sennybridge without the forestry blocks. Is that a fair assessment?
In a nutshell, yes. Sennybridge, take away all the trees, all the major bushes, and you've got the Falklands. Rolling moorland, peat bogs, no trees whatsoever. So very, very little natural cover from the elements.
But an ideal ground that parachute battalions had already trained on, in essence. Is that a fair assessment?
And the commandos as well, obviously, with their Arctic history.
Yeah.
Combined with frequent rivers to cross, none of them too deep, thankfully, at those crossing points. Very small mountains, very rock-strewn mountains they were. And we had a geological anomaly called rock runs running down from some of these features. And that's like a boulder field. And you have boulders the size of a football up to the size of a car, basically strewn in your path at varying depths. And they were that bad that they actually held up one of the commando attacks during our brigade attack on the night of the 11th, 12th of June. That's how bad these things were. So we're crossing them in the pitch dark, and they were obviously ankle breakers of the highest order. So that's the kind of ground that we had to cross. Very heavily weighed down, obviously, with equipment. So trying to maintain an upright stance when you're standing on very wet, spongy ground is very, very difficult and very, very energy sapping. And you would
a lot of people to lower limb injuries.
We didn't. There was a couple, but not very many at all. Trench foot was the issue. So it was called weather injuries, basically. We were from day one wet. Our boots were wet and never dried. Therefore, obviously, your feet are totally damp day and night. Even when you dried them, and if you had a sleeping bag, which is infrequent, it got into your bag, you put your dry socks on. But again, putting your dry socks away the following day into your smock, they would end up damp as well. So there was no break for your feet.
Yeah. And for any civilians listening, feet are a very basic thing like your feet. If you get something like trench foot, it can make your life an absolute misery.
Yeah, well, we all had it to varying degrees. Some worse than others, and some guys did fall out with trench foot. It's one of those things that it does get bad. It's very, very painful, but you've just got to hack it. It's as simple as that. And most guys did.
So looking at, Colin mentioned it about the equipment that the Argentinian forces had and the all bats for the British. Looking at the kit, what we get today in the 21st century, the soldiers in Afghan and Iraq, it's got some tremendous kit. What was the kit like for that campaign? You can talk about the commandos and the parachute regiment being light infantry, and probably had some of the best kit that the Green Army could possibly have. Tell me something about the kit.
I'll tell you what, I wish that statement was true.
That's you shot down, Kev.
Yeah, smacks.
Yeah, we did. The only thing that really was different to what anybody else in the British Army was issued was our parachute helmet, our parachute smock, and our SAS Paraburgans. The rest of our equipment was really pretty much bog standard to what the rest of the British Army was wearing, whether we're back in the UK or on the plains of northern Germany. So it was a parasmock, a KF shirt, which was a leftover from World War II, a heavy-duty woolen jumper, an Arctic string vest, would you believe, that we were issued?
Did you wear one, Jim?
All the time. Yep. We also got issued Arctic long johns. We wore the standard denims, puttees around our ankles, again, another World War and Ball One bloody leftover, and the infamous DMS boot on our feet.
Could you describe DMS boot, Jimmy? Because I think if there's any civilians listening or people a good bit younger than us, might just describe why the DMS boot contributed so much to the trench foot problem.
Right, the DMS boot was a very short ankle boot. It was not waterproof in any shape or form, and once it got wet, it stayed wet. So it provided very little ankle support and very little waterproofing, which obviously in an environment like the South Atlantic was vital. As a result of that, as I said earlier, the feet stayed wet. Other than that, it was a great boot. I'd worn it in the jungle and worn it in the desert, fine. But for these Arctic conditions, in a wet, boggy environment, they were the death knell to a lot of guys' feet. I think across the task force, there was something like 150 guys fell out with lower limb injuries, with cold weather injuries relating to the footwear. So that was our basic equipment. On the way down Ascension, we received the Arctic Warfare jackets and trousers from the resident Arctic Warfare Battalion back in the UK. Mm. I think they gave us every bit of knackered kit that they had. Because these much lauded Arctic Warfare smocks, when you held them up to the light, you could actually see the sky through them.
Yeah.
they were that thin and that worn, and the trousers were exactly the same. So the guys were a mixture, really, of the temperate climate UK stuff, standard denims, parasmock, or a mix of windproof jacket, windproof trousers.
And I think it's probably fair to say, Jimmy, back in 82, the Army's very well equipped nowadays, but even your civvy outdoor gear nowadays is a mega. But there was nothing much you could have privately purchased back then anyway, I don't think. The fleece jackets didn't really exist or things like that. There was a much private purchase of kit?
No, not at all. Those days, Gore-Tex was a German porn mag. Totally unheard of. Waterproofs were of like a plastic composite material. It's like wearing a packet of crisps.
Yeah, yeah.
So not only was it noisy, it also retained any body heat. So if you didn't get wet with the rain, you got wet with the sweat. So we very, very rarely used them as well. So yeah, we didn't get a chance really to go down to town and buy anything Gucci. I think I bought a pair of gloves and that was it. And that was as good as it got. There was no down jackets, no Gore-Tex jackets, nothing like that. So no, very little private. But again, you could have worn what you wanted, to be honest. Some guys did wear Barber jackets and the like. If you had it and it was relatively military, you put it on and nobody was concerned whatsoever. But on the whole, we were wearing stuff that you would wear in Salisbury Plain or the northern plains of Germany.
Yeah. And infantry weapons, the small arms that you took, and optics, what sort of general kit did you have for that?
Again, standard issue at the time with a little bit of difference due to our role. Each infantry section, and you would have three platoons in a company and 3 sections in each platoon. They would have a GPMG. Everybody else would be armed with an SLR. Within the platoon, there would be one 84mm Carl Gustaf, which is like a bazooka. Mm-hmm. Okay, anti-tank weapon and very effective at bunker busting. That was it really at company level. Self-loading rifles, GPMGs, and 84mm anti-tank weapons. Support weapons-wise, we had the GPMG and sustained fire roll, a platoon's worth of that. We had 6 81mm mortars, and we had, I believe, 4 Milan posts with as many missiles as the guys could carry, which was a fair few. Those of us who were gun, we carried general purpose machine guns, again with the potential to turn them into the sustained fire roll as well. So weapon systems, pretty standard to an infantry unit. The only difference was we had a machine gun platoon as well as the machine guns that were within the companies. So we're quite GPMG, light machine gun heavy.
A lot of weight to carry on top of all your personal kit as well.
It was, and we'll come to that in a minute. So, weapons-wise, that was just about it. Optics, there were some of the sight unit infantry Trilux still around. And there was a slack handful of those scattered throughout the rifle companies. That's a very simple ×4 magnification telescopic sight, for want of a better description, to keep it simple. We, with regards to night vision, had the individual weapon sight, the IWS. It was a first generation night vision optic, and it was almost as large and as heavy as the SLR. And it wasn't very effective in poor light conditions. Unfortunately, when we eventually attacked Longdon, we attacked in poor visibility conditions, and the IWSs didn't perform too fantastic. We also had it support company level 1 or 2 night observation devices, NODs, which is like a very large individual weapon sight, and that's normally mounted on a tripod and used for controlling direct fire onto targets. And that's exactly how we used it on Longdon, the one that was actually taken up to the top of the mountain. So very, very simple. And as I'll discuss later on, the optics and weapons issued to the Argentine forces that we were facing were far superior to what we had. So they outnumbered us physically, and their weapons were far better, and their night sights were just a different world altogether to what we were carrying.
Usual story for the British Army, that, isn't it?
I'm afraid so. So.
So before we move on to the ground campaign then, Jimmy, I just want to probably talk a little bit about risk, because I think the Army's attitude to risk back then was a lot different to it is now. And I think we've already touched on that with the 3 service chiefs having World War II experience. But, one thing, listen to your conversation there, no mention of body armour. And in this day and age, the British Army would not go anywhere without body armour. It's also interesting to see when you read accounts of the Falklands about the decisions taken at battalion level that I doubt would even get off the drawing board now. Now, for example, you might correct me on this, but I believe the Scots Guards attacked Tumbledown with berets on and no helmets because they thought it would aid recognition.
That's absolutely right.
And can you imagine a battalion commander making that decision now?
No.
No, I don't think there's much chance of that. It'd be straight in the papers and some mum would be complaining somewhere.
Yeah. And there's a principle that normally applies to military vehicles. You know, mobility, firepower, or protection. Pick any two. So if you pick heavy weapons and protection for the vehicle, you can kiss goodbye to mobility. And you look at what the contemporary soldier carried in Afghanistan. If you had to fight in all that body armor and everything else, Jimmy, do you think it would have been impossible? Would you think you'd have been successful with weighed down with all that body armor and kit that the modern soldier carries?
No, I think that would have been detrimental to the assault. I didn't myself, but the company that I was with stripped off their webbing and assaulted Longdon in their parasmocks.
Wow.
And that's where the mobility came in. Yeah. We were fighting in the pitch dark in amongst rocks. Mm-hmm. Therefore, body armor and all the other extra bits and bodies the lads carried these days, even chest webbing, I wouldn't have wanted that on me. You need to better get down when you need to get down. And I think we'd have been like turtles up in those rocks if we'd had to carry that kind of kit. Body armor, no way would we have worn that, even if we had the offer. Not a chance. We would have left that behind. We needed mobility. One of the lessons I learned is that the longer you're up, the more chances are you're going to get shot. When you're up, you've got to be moving fast. Mm. Just don't give the opposition a chance to get more than a couple of rounds off at you. If we'd have been more overloaded than we were, and we were our smocks weighed pounds and pounds and pounds because our pockets were full of ammo. But any more weight than that, yeah, that would have caused casualties. In my belief, guys would not been able to move fast enough in close contact with the enemy.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. I mean, it's probably quite controversial, but it's certainly a discussion we could go down a rabbit hole on. But you look at what guys have to carry now with all the day sacks and the body armor, and they're like modern day knights on the battle space. It's no mobility whatsoever. So, Jimmy, can you just talk us through the ground campaign from your perspective leading up to the Argentinian surrender?
Okay, I'll start from the initial beach landing. For us in Free Power, that was the morning of the 22nd of May. So the task force basically anchored up in San Carlos water, which was to the western side of East Falklands. So basically in Lima Stanley, but at the far side of the island. So 2 Power landed first. The whole landing was supposed to be in the dark. For many reasons, 2 Power's landing, the timings were extended, which led to us, unfortunately, carrying out our landing assault in daylight because we were using the same landing craft that 2 Para was using. So that was 2 Para and 2 of the commando units in 3 Para landing in San Carlos water that morning. We embarked from HMS Intrepid. That was our assault ship, having cross-decked to that from the Canberra, just short of the exclusion zone. Went ashore and basically deployed in the vicinity of the Port San Carlos settlement. We had an enemy OP just north of us on a location called Fanning Head, which basically was a jutting point of land that came out into the water and dominated the whole of San Carlos water. That was being pummeled by naval gunfire as we got into the assault craft and then headed into the beach. So we've got an engagement going on our left. We knew there were any enemy forces in Port San Carlos, numbers unknown. As it was, as we were approaching Port San Carlos, they basically left the location and bugged out in the general direction of Stanley. We got all 3 companies on shore, deployed the rifle companies up onto the high ground above Port San Carlos, myself being with B Company at that time. As I said, I'm a dedicated B Company detachment, and I stayed with B for the entire campaign. So the battalion HQ settled around the settlement itself, which consisted of a farm, and a family of about 7 or 8. All the rifle companies dug in on the high ground, sitting above Port San Carlos and above the water, and basically dominated our area of the beach landing with 2 Para and the commandos just south of us. We'd only, I think, got halfway up the feature when we saw our first Pucara ground attack aircraft, and that appeared to our south, just at the other side of the water, and basically tactically flew along a ridge line, observing our move up the mountain and obviously the disembarkation of the troops onto the landing areas. So the pilot skimmed along the ridgeline, got a look at the landing, and then basically disappeared over the other side of the ridge and went back to report to the forces in Stanley itself. So the game was up at that stage of the game, and we expected and did receive the Argentinian Air Force arriving in the Sound about an hour or so later. By that time, thankfully, we'd got up to the rocks and we dug ourselves in. The water table is very high in the Falklands. A lot of the guys hit water straight away, so it's a case of building up as opposed to digging down. So it's cutting the turf from the peat and building a sanger, which basically is an improvised bunker made of either rock or compacted earth, soil, turf. And that's how we basically dug ourselves in to those defensive positions. We dug down in a simple fire trench, 6 foot by 4, or we built a sanger using the peat and rocks that were available. And we got ourselves in a couple of hours. It's very easy digging. We then test fired all the mortars, sorted out some defensive fire plans, and started tying in all the arcs of fire between the different platoons and different companies of the battalion to cover ourselves and to cover the landing areas. As I said, about mid-afternoon, the Argentinian Air Force turned up. I think there was something like 30 aircraft on the first attack, and basically attacked every vessel within Falklands Sound. They were all at anchor at the time, apart from the Royal Navy frigates. And that went on for the next 4 or 5 days. Incessant air attacks on the anchored supply ships and on the Royal Navy destroyers and corvettes that were within the Sound. They were basically covering the logistical move from the landing ships onto the shore. So it was all the heavy stuff, all the stores needed to support that attack. We were very aware that this was a one-shot operation. It was either going to work or we we're going to end up stuck in the middle of the South Atlantic with no ammunition, no supplies, and basically dead in the water.
Did you witness any of the ships being sunk by the Argentinian Air Force, Jimmy?
Yeah, unfortunately, we had a grand view of the whole of the water. It's not something that we wanted to see, and to be honest, it depressed us quite greatly. And yeah, it just enhanced our feelings of gratitude to the Navy for, one, getting us there in the first place, and two, for staying put and supporting the rest of that logistic resupply coming ashore from all the support vessels that were there. And the Canberra itself was plonked right in the middle of the Sound with the Reserve Commando Battalion on it, which I think was 4-2 at the time. So there's a hell of a lot of really juicy targets sitting in that Sound. And literally, as one air attack would finish, half an hour later, there was another one, and that just went on and on and on. We were getting updates from our CO daily. He would tab up from the farm up to the high ground, basically visit every platoon, every company, and give us an update to what was going on. So we're well aware of what ships were hit, what ships had unexploded bombs on, which was something like, I think, 8 at one stage of the game. I think it was either Antelope or Ardent blew up at 1 o'clock in the morning and literally just lit up the world when that went up. We could see through our binos the holes in the ship's sides of some of the Navy vessels, and the fact that, again, they were staying on station with unexploded bombs on board. It was absolutely unbelievable. But we needed to get going. That was the bottom line. We were witnessing our Navy being sunk. We needed to get going. Okay, and you've already mentioned the Atlantic Conveyor, which had the Air Squadron on board, the Chinooks, and I believe some Wessexes. Fortunately, the Harriers that were on board that, prior to getting it hit by the Exocet that struck the vessel, they'd already flown off. But the Chinooks less one all went down. So that was our heli mobility out of the window almost immediately. It just left us with what the Navy had brought with them, which is the Commando Air Squadron and the Naval Air Squadron guys, and that was us. So there was no way there was going to be any significant quantity of troops moved by air. That was totally out of the question once the Atlantic Conveyor was sunk with that squadron.
As terrible as those sinkings were, it could have been a lot worse, because you mentioned there, Jimmy, about the sheer quantity of unexploded ordnance, and part of that reason was that the Argentinian armourers were setting the bombs.
Oh, yeah.
Because they had to attack so low, they released the bombs too low. Testimony to their bravery, but thankfully for us, they were setting the bombs wrong.
We were very, very lucky in that respect. It could have been a disaster. It was a close run thing, as was said after the event. A few more ships going down we'd have been in trouble. We would have still carried on with the land campaign. There's no way we were going to sit there. We'd have still eventually pushed ourselves towards Stanley, but our logistical support, our Navy support, would be gone. And that would have been an absolute disaster, as it nearly was. It was heartbreaking to sit there in our trenches watching these guys getting pummeled day after day after day. Frequently, we would have Argentinian aircraft. They would engage the ships and then get out of there as fast as they could. The air defences weren't fantastic at that stage of the game. The sea slugs that the Navy used weren't fantastic. They had Bofors guns on some of the older vessels, again, antiquated. And the Rapier system that we took ashore, air defence, again, took days to settle in. And again, didn't actually knock down too many aircraft from what I could see.
I think, again, it goes back to that. But the attitude at the time from the hierarchy was they accepted the losses, which I don't think today would have accepted those losses. Would have then sued for peace and looked for a political outcome instead of carried on with the campaign, because the attitude from the senior ranks would have been, during the Second World War, they'd lost ships under them. They'd flown in, like you say, bombing raids over Germany. So every time a bombing raid went out, some of the aircraft would not come back and cruise. And so there was a definite acceptance of loss again versus the success of the campaign. I think today, and Colin's already said this, I don't think we have the same attitude politically or at the senior military ends, because we don't have that experience anymore or that exposure.
So you must have been glad, Jimmy, when the breakout and you get out of those trenches and do something came along. Was that a bit of a relief when that happened?
Yes, it was. As I said, it was depressing to sit there and watch the Navy get pummeled day in, day out. And obviously they were going to sit there for as long as we were around. So we finally broke out from the beachhead. I think it was around about the 28th of May. We started a battalion advance to contact going west, heading east towards Stanley. We didn't know where our final destination was going to be. We knew ultimately we were going to be attacking Stanley. That was the goal. But we were going to go via various settlements en route and conduct it as an advance to contact, depending on what we hit as we went from one end of the island to the other. One of the other commandos followed a similar route, but visiting different settlements on the way, and 2 Para left its defensive positions and started heading towards Goose Green to attack the strategic reserve of the Argentinians, which was based down at Goose Green itself on the isthmus there. So we've got 2 Para heading down there to attack Goose Green, and you've got 1 commando unit and 3 Para basically now conducting 2 advance to contacts across the island to eventually close with the enemy at Stanley. That's probably physically one of the hardest things I've ever done in my 22 years in the army. The ground, combined with the conditions and the operational weights that we were carrying, it was just backbending, absolutely wearisome.
Was this just like a battalion snake, Jimmy, was it? Or
right, the way we played it, right at the point of the battalion, you would have the point company, okay? The point platoon of that company will be in an attack formation. Okay, so first call signs are moving tactically. Behind them, you've then got the rest of the battalion moving in what we call half attack. Very simply, that is the battalion snake. It's B company, one behind the other, off to a flank, C company, one behind the other, and then B doing exactly the same. So tactical at the front, ready to react depending on what we hit. The rest of the company is basically sitting back in the saddle and tabbing. Out on the flanks and well forward of the battalion, you've got our patrol company. So they are providing flank protection during the move. They're in front of us, clearing choke points like river crossing locations. And we would sit outside the settlements until they'd been in and cleared them. And obviously they are the eyes and ears of the battalion. So they're out there gathering intelligence as well. Mounting OPs, mobile patrols. More about those guys later on. Their task over there was very, very demanding, and they had an outstanding role. They had a real good war. So, day and night, tabbing. We tabbed during the day, rested maybe every couple of hours for 10 minutes, and we just tabbed and tabbed and tabbed. Distance-wise, it was about 50 miles to our final destination, as it turned out to be, which was Mount Longdon. But obviously, moving tactically, it was far more than 50 miles, with many dog legs in between. Light skills, which in effect is our assault order, which is our weapons, our optics, our ammunition, a bit of food, our heavy weapon systems, mortars, Milans, bipods, tripods, barrels, everything being man-packed. So we were literally human mules. And this, unfortunately, is where Fire Brigade got caught out when they landed. The guys weren't very fit, and they found it impossible to carry operational loads and had to be moved by sea, which led partially to the issue with the attack on the Galahad later on in the campaign. So it was where the fitness basically of the Para-Reg and Marines came to the fore. It was moving tactically across broken ground with operational assault loads. So, as I say, this was day and night, basically. You were stumbling, you were falling into bogs, you were clambering across rock runs, very little breaks. It was freezing cold, so when you stopped, you were thankful to ease the weight off your shoulders, but within 5 minutes, it was freezing cold again, and you just wanted to move. So it was a no-win situation all the time. We had one river crossing on day one, and I'll never forget the B Company Sergeant Major. As I got to the far bank, having waded through the river, he said to the guys around him, "This is going to separate the men from the boys." And it did. It's exactly what it did. But to their credit, most of the guys completed that tab. So after a couple of days, we arrived outside Till Inlet, which is a small settlement of about, I think, some 5 or 6 families. Our patrols went in first, cleared it, and then guided us into the location. We spent one night there, dug in to defend ourselves, and then cracked on with the advance to contact the following day. I did manage to get into a sheep shearing shed for about an hour that night and wrap myself in some sheepskins.
Well, a 5-star luxury that must have been, Jimmy.
Well, put this with the ticks. Thought it was 5-star luxury. Yeah, they were a nightmare, but it didn't spend long in there. It was just full of ticks. But it was a welcome break just to get out of that incessant wind and cold for half an hour or so. So back on the march again a repetition, day and night tabbing. We then finally arrived outside the settlement of Estancia House, which is a farm on the shoreline, some maybe 8 or 9 miles away from Stanley. We at this stage had totally outstripped the rest of the brigade. We were on our own. So our colonel was basically told to stop. All right, we'd outstrip the guns, we'd outstrip the ammo, and we'd outstrip the resupply. Bearing in mind, all this time we hadn't had our Bergens either, so there was no sleeping bags to sleep in or anything like that. We were just living out in the open.
How many days? Sorry, Jimmy. How many days had you been without your Bergens at this point? Do you reckon?
On the actual tab, we didn't have them at all, and we got them after about day 6, I believe.
Bloody hell.
About day 6. We occupied the high ground above Estancia, which is Estancia Mountain and Mount Vernet. So again, Battalion HQ stayed down at the farm complex. All the rifle companies dug in up on the high ground above it. Our patrol platoon established a patrol base halfway in between Mount Estancia and Mount Longdon, basically looking up to the high ground around Stanley, covering Longdon, Harriet, Two Sisters, and Tumbledown Mountains. They were basically looking at the route that we were going to use to attack Longdon, getting eyes on, and then conducting close target reconnaissance on Longdon itself once brigade confirmed that that was going to be our task on the night of the brigade attack. So as we're digging in, we also mounted fighting patrols to dominate the area around our defensive position. And we also mounted OPs, and I took part in both OPs and the fighting patrols that went out. We, on one of them, dug in around the Murrow Bridge on the Murrow River, which ran in between us and Longdon, with the view that we would then hold that bridge for the battalion to attack Longdon the following day. Bearing in mind, we had no artillery, just the ammo that we had on us at the time, and no other support. And our intention was to just go up and attack Longdon. No support from anybody. We moved during the night, forded the Murrow River, took some engineers, our parachute engineers with us. We dug in around the bridge, they cleared the bridge, and we just sat there, knowing full well that when it got daylight in the morning, we were going to be in trouble. And we certainly were. The first thing we saw that morning was the foo party tabbing up the side of Tumbledown. Then about 20 minutes later, the first rounds started coming down. We were basically registered both forward sections and the rear section and platoon HQ with mortar, and then the 155s came in and 50 cals from Tumbledown. As far as we were concerned, that position was untenable at that stage of the game. Told the platoon commander so and left. We were very, very lucky. A low-level fog came down, and we used that as cover to withdraw. There was no way we could hold that sitting out in the open, surrounded by all that high ground, and in range of their artillery and heavy weapon systems. But that's just an example of one of the fighting patrols that we put out. The patrols, in the meantime, daily and nightly, are creeping around Mount Longdon. They got right into the feature. So when it came to our plan of attack, it was based on information that the patrols platoon or company had gathered. It was absolutely indispensable. We knew there's a minefield around Longdon. We knew where parts of it were, but not the full extent or the depth. So it's quite obvious that when we did mount the attack, we were going to have to walk through that minefield. There was just no way around it. The para-engineers crawled into the minefield, dug up some of the mines, brought them back so we could get a look at them and they could study them. We tried to get the extent of the minefield, but it was just impossible. It was just too long. It basically went around the whole of Longdon in a horseshoe shape, and we were going to walk through the centre of that horseshoe eventually.
So there was no attempt, Jimmy, to clear lanes or anything. It was just a case of crossing your fingers and hoping for best. Is that a fair assessment?
That's exactly what it was. Unfortunately, hoping for the best didn't quite work, as we'll go on to later on. But at least we were aware that it was there. I think I'd rather have been not told. But there you go. But no, the patrol company's work on Longdon was outstanding, and a few of the guys got some very high decorations for the work that they carried out. The close target reconnaissance was just outstanding. We knew the locations of many of the 50 caliber machine guns. We knew where their mortar pits were, sentry positions, the ground radar that they had, and the like. And as I say, those guys were on their bellies and they got right into that position and carried out some fantastic work. They also engaged the Argentinians now and again just to keep them on their toes. They called in artillery fire once we got it up there. They also brought in some Harrier strikes, and they sniped some of the sentries as well. Again, just to keep forcing ourselves upon the enemy all the time. Downside of that, I suppose, is the fact that they knew we were there, but at the same time, they would have been able to easily see us from Longdon while we were dug in around Mount Ascension and Vernet. We'd have been in full view. So that's where we were. We came to a halt. The rest of the brigade caught up with us. The battalion echelon at Estancia House at the farm became the brigade echelon. So basically everything started to move in around there, ready to support Free Commando Brigade on its attack on the high ground that surrounded Stanley. And the high ground was the key to taking Stanley itself. So that's where we were at that stage of the game. Dug in on those two features, patrolling ahead, dominating the ground, and carrying out close target recce's on Mount Longdon, which had then been confirmed as Free Para's target for the night of the 11th, 12th of June.
And that, did you feel then that, I mean, the way you've just described that operation, that's pretty much the bread and butter of your battalion, played heavily into the skills set available, would you say as well, Jimmy?
Yeah, 100%. This is what we get paid for. So it was our ballpark, and it couldn't really be any better for regards to what a parachute or indeed a commando battalion does.
So what was the next stage then?
Okay, brigade planning based on our patrolling and the various commando units, CTRs and fighting patrols. From there, they then put a plan together to attack those mountain features that were the gateway to the entry into Stanley. And it was going to be a brigade attack with one parachute battalion, which was Free Para attacking Longdon, and the two other commando battalions attacking Two Sisters and Mount Harriet. The worst are supposed to be two noisy attacks, which is the two commando ones, and ours is going to be silent. And again, the CO had decided that given the British infantry standard of training and night fighting capability, and that we were used to fighting at night, we were going to attack Longdon with no prior artillery or naval bombardment preparation. we were going to get as near as we could to the position, or indeed onto it before it went kinetic. So we had the guns on standby, but they were on call, and Free Power went in silent. The 2 Marine battalions were going to go in about half an hour behind us and attack their 2 locations and go noisy right from the word go. Who's right, who's wrong, I don't know, but I would have preferred to have gone noisy. I would have liked that location to be prepped, because going in silent was double-edged and eventually worked against us to a degree. And again, I'll discuss why later on. We were given our orders from the colonel down to company level, and then that briefing obviously cascaded down to those of us in the platoons within the companies. Our platoon, 6th platoon, we're going to attack the very top of Mount Longdon. And the best way of describing Longdon, we were looking at it side on from our position, and it looked to me like a lion laid down with its legs out in front of it. So we were going to go up the slopes of Longdon, the legs, as a platoon. We are then going to assault the head of the lion, the top of Longdon on that end. We're then going to run down the neck, onto the back, down to the back end, and run along the tail, basically rolling Longdon up from one point all the way through to the final end of it. And if we could and we were capable, we were going to roll up Wireless Ridge as well. As it turned out, that wasn't possible. So that's 6th platoon. We were going to attack the head of the lion. The 2 other rifle platoons of B Company were going to attack along the flank of the lion. So we'd be at the top, fighting along the top. The other 2 platoons were fighting along the flank of the mountain itself. A Company were kept just short of the mountain, ready to support B Company in its attack or to exploit any breakthrough. C Company was held off to a flank in reserve. Those 2 companies were also engaged from where they were during the attack as well, prior to arriving on the mountain, but again, more about that later on. Very simply, the whole battalion was engaged at some stage of the game by enemy fire. So, for us as the platoon, we were going to be led on the objective by a guy from Patrol Company, and obviously it's one of the lads who had carried out the close target reconnaissance on our particular section of the mountain. We knew that they had bunkered positions throughout the entire mountain itself. It was very steep, but only a couple of 100 feet high, strewn with very, very large rock runs. And this is like a wall of rock. If you think of the back of a dinosaur, the scales on the back of a dinosaur, that's what they were like. They were 2-story in height, and they basically ran from the bottom of the mountain up to the top. And there'd be something like a 20-meter gap between each rock run. So very simply, there was no room for maneuver. You were trapped on your left by a rock run, trapped on your right by a rock run, and you could only advance straight up what was in reality a killing zone for the enemy.
Ideal defending ground, really, isn't it?
It was very, very well defended. We had the B Company group of the 7th Infantry Regiment of the Argentinian Army on the mountain, with a platoon of Marines with their 50 cal machine guns. They had a platoon of engineers who bizarrely were issued with the most up-to-date Knighton 2nd generation rifle night vision aids. So they had approximately a third more men than we had attacking them on the mountain as a company group. Very, very well entrenched, very well sighted bunkers made out of rocks from the feature itself, which they camouflaged and merged in with the existing topography of the mountain. So even in daylight, they were very, very hard to see. They were at the base of the rocks, they were up the rocks, and they were on top of the rocks. They were absolutely everywhere. Their killing areas were well defined, their sustained fire weapons, firing on fixed lines, brilliant killing areas, and their platoons and sections were all tightly knit together in mutual support. And that is what we faced to attack. We had no room for maneuver due to the ground, so at any one time, we were never going to get more than a company on that feature. There was just no room to maneuver to flank left or right, given the ground that we were given. So we were going to go in silent, led by our guides. We left our defensive positions on the night of the 11th, just as it got dark. Again, a battalion snake all the way down as far as the Murrow River. The Murrow River was halfway between us and Longdon. It was a significant water obstacle. Our parachute engineers, somehow from somewhere, got hold of a ladder, and they very simply improvised a simple infantry bridge over the Murrell River. And that's how the entire battalion crossed that river. I have no recollection of crossing it myself, but that's how we did. Those parachute engineers were absolutely fantastic. Very, very brave men. And they went into the assault with us. Just a point about that, because it's reminded me, when we went into the assault, we took everybody. Rifle companies, cooks, bottle washers, pay corps, everybody got taken into the assault. The mailed fist were the rifle companies. Support company formed fire bases to fire in the attack and support the assaulting companies. The cooks, bottle washers, pay corps, they carried as much ammunition as they could get on their backs, ammunition in, and they carried casualties out. So the whole battalion went into the assault, whether you were paratrained or not, we took everybody. Those ACC cooks and the pay corps guys that pulled those casualties off the mountain under fire were as brave as hell. And every guy in the battalion admired those guys for the work that they carried out, up and beyond their normal trade. They were absolutely fantastic. Brave to a man. More about that later on.
Jeremy, sorry, can I just ask you a quick question? So, looking at after you'd had your orders, and obviously you could see during the daylight what you were going to attack. Did you ever thinking, oh my God, this is an impossible task, or were you confident that this was within your capabilities?
At no time did we think that we couldn't carry this off. I mean, there was nothing gung-ho about it. We were all quietly aware of what 2-Power had achieved down at Goose Green. The CO had given us all the casualty list. We'd had friends killed down at Goose Green. We knew this was for real. Plus, obviously, we're in a war-fighting zone from basically the exclusion zone onwards. Ships were being sunk. We were being attacked as well by aircraft while we were being dug in. So we're very aware all the time that, you know, this is real. Guys were going to get killed. But at the same time, we were confident that we were going to carry out our part in this attack. And that brigade attack was going to be successful. And we would carry out our part in it to the whole.
So it's a mindset, isn't it? It's the whole brigade must have had that mindset then. You know, you're just going to go forward.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not big-headed to say they had the right troops in Free Commando Brigade to make that campaign work. Without doubt, we were the best soldiers available in the British Army and the Navy at that time. It was us. And we were going to achieve it, regardless of the casualties. The mission came first, and it was going to happen. So we set out that evening. My call sign had changed its composition a wee bit. We'd had a mix around of the various weapon systems in relation to our platoon's mission. I was given 2 84 teams with the 84mm Carl Gustaf, and we were going to be bunker busting, basically. That was going to be our role. I lost my machine gun team to one of the sections with the proviso that I'd get them back after the initial assault. I never did because my gunner was hit anyway. I had the Bravo mortar fire controller because we were the point platoon, so he was going to stick with the platoon commander and call down fire as and when required from our mortars. And I also took up the company medic. So that was my call sign. So we were integral to B Company, integral to 6th Platoon, and 6th Platoon's mission was to take the top half of the mountain. So we crossed the Murrell Bridge. It was a very cold night, intermittent moonlight, but mainly low cloud. It had snowed, so very crisp, clear, quiet night. All you could hear really was the crunch of our feet of a battalion advancing to the attack. We were aware that somewhere on our right were the 2 commando battalions, also on the move as well. One of them unfortunately hit one of the rock runs that I described earlier on, and it slowed them right down. I think they lost something like 45 minutes to an hour putting their attack in, just getting their guys across that rock run. So we found ourselves having crossed the Murrell Bridge, which in reality was our start line. That's the last safe moment. So we were now in full assault mode, approaching towards Longdon. The first indication that we were observed by somebody on the mountain was one illume round being fired by the Argentinians. I think we'd been picked up by their ground locating radar, and they'd put up one illume. It sounded to me when it was flying through the air like it was tumbling, so I don't think it was functioning correctly. But we all very slowly got down to the ground as it was still gaining altitude, and then eventually it didn't do its job, and it just impacted on the ground and then functioned. So all they've now got off to a flank is what would have been, I assume, a parachute flare, which is now just burning away merrily and not being any bother to us whatsoever. But that was an indication they might have had an idea that we were out there. Bearing in mind our patrols had been bugging them every night of the week, so they might have just put it up for the sheer hell of it and the off chance of catching out one of our patrols. We then closed towards the base of Longdon, and unfortunately we were in the minefield, and the start of the whole battle was one of the section commanders in B Company stepping on one of the mines and losing his lower leg. That obviously woke up the Argentinians, and then straight away they engaged the two platoons who were going to assault the lower flanks of Longdon. As it was in that minefield, I think eventually we had something like 3 guys lost their lower limbs in that minefield. They believe that the extreme cold temperatures lent to some of the mechanical devices of the mines freezing and not activating when pressure was applied. So I think we were quite lucky in just those few numbers. So there we were. We're in the middle of the minefield. We've got a contact going, and we've now got to get ourselves to the base of this mountain and start our assault. Our platoon SOP was to leave our webbing at the base of Longdon and assault in our parasmocks, okay, having bombed up every pocket we possessed with ammunition, spare magazines, grenades, whatever we had at the time. I personally didn't leave my fighting order off. It's the one thing I just never do, and it's just nothing that any soldier ever does is separate himself from his kit. But that was their choice. They wanted to be light and running free in the rocks, and that's what they did. I kept mine on me. So we were led up the slope by our particular guide. Amazingly, we passed the lower bunkers with no sign of any occupation. That worked against us later on in the evening. So very simply, we got up the lion's legs, up that slope, out of contact, other than some fire that we received from a way over on our right. It was very high. It was all tracer. It was flying above our heads. Not a big deal, even though I think I loosed off something like a half a mag in the general direction.
Those empty bunkers, Jimmy, do you think the Argentinians just vacated them and moved back to the main position?
Yeah, I think what some of them were doing at night time, I believe they were leaving those forward locations and going back and sleeping in tents.
Right.
Because we found some tents up there. However, that wasn't the case in all of them. And people did emerge later to then engage us from bunkers that we had bypassed. And again, I'll go into a wee bit more detail about that in a minute. So very simply, we 6th Platoon got to the top, almost out of contact, because most of the firefight was going on below us and to our left with the 2 other flanking platoons of B Company. However, that all changed the minute we literally went over the top on reaching the top, and we were then right in the middle of a platoon location, right in the middle of the company location. So we were then getting engaged 360. Some guys were on top of positions, some were in front of them, some had bypassed them. So basically getting fire now from every direction you can think of and above us out of the rocks, and people are dropping like flies. We took a hell of a lot of casualties very, very quickly. We had section commanders killed, section commanders wounded, platoon sergeants wounded, platoon commanders wounded, all very, very quickly. So any form of recognized fighting organization very quickly broke down as a result of that. People were stranded around one rock run, separate from the rest of their section. Half a platoon would be around one side, half are being channeled up another. We were in the killing areas of the dug-in sections and dug-in platoons, and on the sustained fire lines of their GPMGs and their 50 cals. So we took in B Company a hell of a lot of casualties very, very quickly. However, privates in the regiment don't need corporals to tell them what to do. So as bunkers were identified, they would be taken out. That'd be a very, very slow process. 1 of identifying exactly where it is and what it is. 2 of trying to get some form of covering fire onto the bunker, while 2 guys, or however many, would crawl up on their belt buckles and get some grenades into it to silence it. The issue being we couldn't see these guys. So with our fellas identifying a bunker, putting in an assault on the bunker, and then being killed by another bunker on the flank that we couldn't see in the dark. The IWSs were literally useless in the available light at the time, given it was low cloud.
This is pretty much a section level war at this point, Jimmy. Would you say a section level attack? I know you can probably say about most operations, it goes down to section level. But I get an impression from your discussion here that you have literally got sections and half sections just cracking on their own and find it very hard to interact with and consolidate with other sections in either side of them. Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly. It was very, very difficult for any platoon commander to control what his sections were doing. 9 times out of 10, they were out of sight. They were split up, and key personalities were dead, including some of the radio operators. So information coming back as well was sketchy. All you were getting was screams, shouting, grenades going off, incessant fire, walls of tracer flying absolutely everywhere, and you didn't know who was who. Thankfully, the Argentinians, bless them, were firing green tracer. Obviously, ours was the old classic British Army red, so that worked in our favour, and it certainly saved us engaging some of our own call signs, even though I myself was engaged by one of the call signs later on in the night. But again, more about that later on. But very, very fractured, very, very slow, and very casualty heavy. And it was literally just breaking down at the smallest common denominator. 2 guys working together, being covered by their mates to slowly pick these bunkers off. And it was not easy because, as I say, as one is identified and engaged, the attackers were engaged from several other bunkers that you couldn't see in the pitch dark. Some guys were literally standing on top of the Argentinians when they were engaged. Right. Literally walked over what they thought was a lump of rock and fell into the trench with 2 Argentinians into it. It was a target indication nightmare. Pitch dark, just flashes everywhere, and trying to ascertain their exact location. Oh, absolutely. Weaponry. The good old SLR that the British Army was issued with at the time. Every time you squeeze the trigger, it fires a round. Excellent weapon in its time. Certainly a battle winner in the 60s. By the 70s and 80s, it's starting to get outdated. And really, we should have been looking at having an automatic weapon by 1982. We didn't. The Argentinians, on the other hand, had the FN, which was the automatic version, if you like, of the self-loading rifle. Very, very accurate. Many of them had bipods. If we weren't getting bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, we were getting sustained fire from them. And it was very, very effective. The issue that gave us was the fact that we could not win the firefight. It was absolutely impossible. That is a basic no-no, that you never assault a position without first getting the enemy's heads down by putting down a volume of fire, which basically ensures that their return fire is inadequate. We couldn't do that. Their firepower was just so great. So we had that to contend with as well. All the assaults were frontal because we couldn't flank, and they were into a weight of fire that we couldn't match. So we had 11 hours of that through the night. 11 hours.
I bet that seemed to pass in seconds, didn't it? Or did it seem 11 hours? I'm just curious. Did that 11 hours go really quickly, or did it feel like longer?
It felt to me something like 6, but we arrived in the dark, and it finished basically in about the first hour of first light the following morning. It was 11 hours, and I would say initially, really, it was just a blur, time-wise, an absolute blur with what was going on. My call sign was heavily engaged. We were engaging bunkers that we could identify with the 84mm. Very, very difficult, but engage them we did. I deployed the medic forward to assist with the casualties. He was killed very shortly afterwards. My gunner was with a section in front of me. He was hit through the throat quite quickly and put out the game. He was one of the guys that unfortunately was laid out on top of the mountain for at least 6-7 hours before we could get forward to them and pull them back. The ground was just littered with dead and wounded paratroopers and dead and wounded Argentinians. For myself, my main issue with the 84 was the fact that we had no night fighting capability, no night sights. One of my number ones, Geordie Lang, was killed very bravely trying to get to some of our wounded out front. And I took over his 84, and it was almost impossible to use the sights to identify a bunker or a target through them. There was just no light gathering capability with the telescopic sight that those weapons had. So I eventually took the telescope off, opened up the open sights, and tried to engage a particular bunker with the open sights. Again, I couldn't get a sight picture that would hold the sight and the bunker. So eventually I just folded the sights along the side of the weapon and aimed the barrel, would you believe, at the bunker. Roughly aligned the barrel with a bunker, and that's how I engaged bunkers through the night. It was rough alignment.
What sort of distance on this, Jimmy, you're doing? What sort of engagement distances?
Well, one of them was that close that the round didn't arm itself, and I think it gets armed after 15 meters or something like that. That's how close that one was. But I think on the whole, they were around about 30 to 40 meters away. Certainly no further than that, because I could only see them during the flash of grenades going off. Maybe a bit of parallel would give me a target, but it's very, very difficult to engage, and it was just rough alignment. And that was as good as it got with that particular weapon system. I was very lucky later on in the night. I bobbed and weaved back to Platoon HQ, told them the issue we had up front with the guys that were laid out from the call sign that was engaged on the top and were wounded in front of us. And our patrol's guide was there dealing with some of our wounded who were in Platoon HQ. And I grabbed this sniper rifle, which had a IWS on it, zeroed on the cross to 300 meters. So I grabbed that and ran back down to my firing position. And I used that for about an hour or so. Intermittently, again, it wasn't fantastic, but when I got a decent sight picture when the moon was out, it worked quite well. And I used that for quite some time. But that really is as good as it got with regards to engaging from our location. It was identification and assault, as good as you could make it with available firepower and the available bodies that you had at that time. So 6th Platoon had achieved its objective. What we couldn't do was sweep along the lines back to the other end, because very simply, we were right in the middle of a defensive position and were fixed in place, for want of a better description. We were fighting what we had around us and couldn't exploit from that point along the spine of the line. Our 2 other platoons below us were in the same state. They were getting into a killing zone, taking casualties, identifying the bunkers, taking them out, moving on into another killing zone, taking casualties, identifying the bunkers. So basically they were hammering themselves again in these killing zones down below us. And that went on for hours. B Company engaged on the mountain on their own. We, at some stage through the night, got naval gunfire onto Longdon. We had a naval gunfire party with us from 148 Battery. And again, they were invaluable, because once depth positions could be positively identified, we could put fire down on them using the gun on the ship that was sitting on the gun line about 4 or 5 miles offshore, supporting us in the attack. It was also invaluable later on in the night in getting some of our casualties who were stuck forward back to the platoon position, again by putting down a very, very close barrage. There was no safety rules. It was as close as it could get without hitting any of our guys who were stood up. It was simple as that. It was very, very accurate indeed. The naval gunfire officer, Willie McCracken, was right up with the point platoon, directing fire as and when required for as long as the gun on that ship was dedicated to us. Bear in mind, obviously, off to our flank, there's another 2 mountains getting attacked as well. We also had 2-9 Commando Royal Artillery in support. I think we had a battery. And again, they were used through the night as and when, mainly on the depth positions that we couldn't engage ourselves with any great degree of accuracy. So slowly but surely, we started building up around 6th Platoon's position. In reality, we became the fire base for the rest of the battalion action on Longdon. So the machine gun platoon was pulled up in the night. The Milan section of the anti-tank platoon was pulled up, and they started engaging with Milan. We also had a nod brought up, and that controlled the fire of both the Milan and the machine gun platoon. And they were basically starting to dominate the depth positions that we couldn't get at from where we were. This allowed A Company, who were in support of us, heading towards First Light, to then come on our flank and then take what was left of the Longdon feature. And they did most of that in daylight at First Light the following morning, so they had the advantage that they could see where they were going. The downside of that was that they had to move for us to get there, and I know it wasn't a great sight for the A Company lads to see all the B Company casualties scattered around the mountain prior to putting their own assault in. But A Company, a great company. We were very lucky. 3 of our company commanders had all been squadron commanders in the SAS. So we had some great experience within the battalion. And A Company put in an excellent, basically belt buckle attack on all the bunker complexes on that lower half of Mount Longdon, eventually securing the entire feature by about an hour into first light, and Longdon was then ours. There was still frequent odd shots going off and the odd grenade for the next couple of hours as the odd trench came to life. It would bypassed or been stumbled upon. But I think probably by about first light +2, it was as near as damn it in our hands. But that then led to other problems in that we were now on Longdon, and that was also a defensive fire location for the Argentinian artillery. And we then, for the next 2 days, were under heavy artillery fire until the ceasefire or the move to our next attack start line. And that caused a hell of a lot of casualties. Over the 3 days we're on Longdon, we lost 23 guys in total.
From artillery fire?
No, most of them during the night attack, but a good 3 or 4 to the artillery fire of the next 3 or 4 days that we were sat on Longdon. The OPs on Tumbledown, until it was taken by the Scots Guard, had an absolute field day with us. And as we found out after the war, there was also an OP north of Longdon, which had a great view of us sitting there as well. So we were raked with their pack howitzers, raked with their 155s day and night for the next couple of days. And that for me was probably the worst part of the whole campaign, I think, was that artillery fire over those coming days. But anyway, first light the following morning, it's a battalion reorganization on the objective. Who's where, who's alive, who's dead, who's with who. So obviously, call signs have got mixed up during the night. I ended up merging the survivors of my section with the survivors of another section of a section commander that was killed. That was then my grouping till the end of the war. I was now a section commander in B Company proper. So I had those guys to re-bomb, replan, basically G them up, get them into their defensive positions and prepare for the next phase of the attack, which was going to be an assault onto the area of the racecourse outside Stanley. And that was going to fall to Free Para. That was our attack. So that morning, what do we have? Basically, bodies all over the mountain, ours and theirs. We managed to get most of the casualties who we couldn't extract due to the volume of fire back to platoon and then down to the RAP. And as I mentioned, my gunner, Mick, had laid out there all night with a round through his throat. And that was just an example of the many, many casualties that laid out there at that time of night with life-threatening injuries that survived. They were evacuated by the Army Catering Corps guys who came forward with their stretchers and took them down to the RAP. The dead Argentinians we buried at the bottom of the hill. Our own dead, and again, one of the worst parts for me was body bagging our mates that had died in the fight during the night. I'd lost one of my guys. My platoon had lost something like 5 or 6 in total, I think. So bagging your mates that some of them I'd known since I was 15, and then taking the bodies down to the RAP was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. Yeah, so first half a dozen hours on that mountain in daylight weren't good at all. The reconsolidation and the recovery of the casualties and the moving of the dead, absolutely heartbreaking. Plus, we didn't know exactly who died. We were getting rumours that friends that had died, others wounded. Some proved to be true, some incorrect. Apparently, I was dead for about 5 hours during the night. Frankly, that turned out to be incorrect. So, yeah, it was the carnage that you would expect to see after a battle, but you're never, ever prepared for, that we were then dealing with. We then quickly reorged. We came under heavy artillery fire from the artillery positions just outside the race course, and we had to withdraw from the top of the mountain and basically hide around the flanks. So basically, we had to stop skylining ourselves on the top of Longdon. We occupied some of their bunkers, which wasn't very nice because it stank, but it was better than being stunk by the artillery. Or you had to make the best of the crevices within the rocks themselves. And literally every time we got a salvo of 3 or 4 rounds or whatever, there'd be a cry of medic after every impact without fail, and that cry of medic has just lived with me forever. Because you would hear the rounds being fired at the racecourse. Some seconds later, you'd hear them coming down and then impacting, and you would know that 9 times out of 10, some guys getting hit, and then you would hear those cries for medic. They mixed in a little bit of airburst as well, which unfortunately caused a fair few casualties. So it wasn't a nice time, actually, sitting on Longdon, preparing for the next attack. And on the night of the 13th, 2 para moved off of our flank, having supported us during the night if required, but they weren't, thankfully. And they then moved on to Wireless Ridge and attacked Wireless Ridge in front of us. They were then going to support our attack from Wireless Ridge onto the racecourse, right onto the edge of Stanley. We were briefed for that on the night of the 13th to put the assault in on the morning of the 14th. C Company, who'd been in reserve, were now going to be the point company. B, who'd taken the brunt of the assault on Longdon, we were going to be in reserve. And it was moving to the start line for that attack. Conducting that move is when we were told that the Argentinians were going to throw in the towel and surrender.
It must have been a momentous moment for when that happened.
A huge sense of relief.
It was double-edged though, because at the same time, we didn't know whether it was just the Argentinians in Stanley, whether it was the Argentinians on East Falkland, or whether we were then going to regroup and attack the garrison on West Falkland. But Stanley was always the key. You could have left those other settlements alone, totally.
You just mopped them up later.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stanley was the key. The Argentinians obviously saw that, having lost their defensive ring of mountains, that it was a waste of time carrying on the fight any longer, and they threw in the towel. We were quite wary, as I said, for those reasons. The other reason is that we've been scrapping for these guys for the last couple of days, and we were only going to be happy when they were either laid dead in front of us or they were there with arms in the air, actually physically throwing in the towel. So we stayed basically on the alert all the time. The only thing that we did do is make safe our weapons, magazines and belts back on, para helmets off, berries on. And we then moved in behind 2 para into Stanley. It was a battle march to get in first.
Get the full opportunities, the flags up.
Exactly. 2 para streaming off of Wireless Ridge with us almost doubling behind them to get in there. But again, we had suspected minefields to move through, so we didn't go non-tack. Absolutely nothing like it. It was butt in the shoulder, still scanning the ground for likely enemy positions, waiting to re-engage if required. And we were very glad to get off that mountain for obvious reasons. We'd been stonked rotten on that thing, and we'd lost a hell of a lot of guys on it. 23 in total over the 3 days we were on the feature, and we had 60 odd wounded, which is a hell of a figure for a night attack and then a couple of days on the mountain. So that's a lot of friends we'd lost and a lot of mates who were suffering life-threatening injuries. And we had no idea at that stage of the game how they were doing and if any of them had died. Thankfully, as you mentioned, Fergie, the red and green life machine over at Ajax Bay, outstanding.
Yeah.
Every guy that went in there got out of there alive.
Did you say you weren't to that at the time, were you?
We weren't. So obviously we're concerned. There was guys I never saw from the start of that war to the end. That's just the way the war was. And to mount a night attack and to go into the assault and then finish it in darkness at first light the following morning, you don't know who survived. You don't know who's been hit. You get rumours. You know that Bill's been hit, Joe's been hit. You don't know how bad they are. And all you're expecting is bad news coming back to say they died in the RAP or they died in the Ajax Bay hospital facility or indeed died on the hospital ships offshore. But medical services, absolutely outstanding.
When you look at those figures, though, you're talking about 90-odd soldiers injured or killed. That's basically one company taken out of the battle.
Absolutely, which is why B were going to be in reserve for the next attack.
Absolutely massive. Think about it on that scale.
It was. We were pretty well mauled. But But given what we'd attacked,
Yeah.
it was a bit expected. Yeah, we mentioned the ratio 3-1 earlier on. We didn't get that. We had no room to maneuver. We couldn't win the firefight. We're in the pitch dark. We couldn't see them. We're in their killing zones. And
And again, it comes back to that thing I mentioned earlier when people go on about, well, they were just conscripts. And you're thinking, it doesn't stack up when you hear the real story.
A 50 caliber machine gun firing it down.
As you said, conscripts, but they always have a professional cadre and they all get taught the same sort of thing and it works.
Yeah, that's right. It worked both ways. We had 17-year-old lads in the company, 2 of which were killed on the night of the attack. And one of them was killed on his 18th birthday that night in the assault. So we had young lads as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, aboard the ships would be young kids who've had no operational experience, their first trip abroad and all the rest of it. So I think when people use that, you hear that sometimes the term is the British Army is the professional army and the Argentines was conscripts, so we had an advantage. I don't think it's true. I believe it's just, it's determination in the end who was going to win.
Fully agree. At the end of the day, to win a battle, you've got to basically break the will of the enemy.
Yeah.
Okay, and at that stage, they decide, I'm not hanging around here, otherwise I'm going to die in place. I'm going to leg it. Or they decide to stay.
Yeah.
And a lot of those Argentinian lads did.
Yeah.
I can remember RT coming down on positions, whatever we could throw at them, and the minute the stonk stopped, the Argentinian fire from that particular position would start again.
Yeah.
Those guys, on the whole, were going to stick it out. They were in cracking, well-defended positions, and they knew it.
Who were they going to go to?
Oh, yeah, there is that.
Well, a fair few of them did go in the first gear for the night and run up down the back end of Longdon.
But Jimmy, I mean, just listen to that description there. I've never heard such a detailed description of it. I've read the books and all the rest of it, but I just could not imagine the sheer confusion, Neil. And you described it. It was down to pairs, the literal pairs fire maneuver, that most basic cog of an attack.
Yep, 100%. That's exactly what it was down to. It was down to the training levels of the soldiers in the paras and the commandos and the Scots Guards for that matter, and the ability of junior soldiers to just crack on when the command structure of a call sign is broken down. They know what the mission is.
Yeah.
And they just carry it out regardless. I don't need a corporal. I know what we're going to do. Joel knows what we're going to do. Let's crack on. And it was down to the skill of the lads at the end of the day. There's some very, very brave men on that mountain who received no recognition whatsoever, but we know who they were.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. All right, they didn't win medals, but we don't care. We know who did what on that mountain, and some of the guys were brave beyond brave. We had guys taking bunkers out who'd already been shot a couple of times. Cracking on.
Yeah.
Absolutely outstanding bravery when the NCOs had been killed, and some outstanding NCOs as well, for that matter. Ian Mackay, who got the VC, one of the platoon sergeants, assaulting a bunker, cracking guy, leading from the front, which is what a platoon sergeant does. My platoon sergeant was hit throwing a grenade, basically lost his hand. Right, platoon sergeant's out of the way, we'll crack on regardless. And that's just the way it is. And any British soldier would do the same, to be honest. We are a mission-focused organisation, and it's a mission every time. You mentioned risk. The risk really didn't come into it for us. It was, I know what I've got to do, and we do it regardless of the cost.
Yeah. That's it for another episode. You can find the original full recordings by looking for episode 9 in the series. Our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes, and you can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. If you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcast from. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.